Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 19. Today, we're going to kind of continue on with the topic of brain and mental health. I'll be honest, I didn't really set out to make this a 3-episode series, but this topic is just so fascinating and so relevant that I just can't stop thinking about it and the implications of it. So, in the previous episodes, we've talked about the brain-body-mind connection. And then we went a little bit deeper onto what I consider the 7 main drivers of brain dysfunction or neurodegeneration and the mental health issues that are coming along with that. So I just want to take this a little bit deeper today and continue this discussion. Let's start off today with a basic premise that we all prefer to be happy. I'm not going out on a limb here, right? Our most important job as an organism is to stay alive. And so in order to do that, we have evolved with certain mechanisms to attach positive feelings with behaviors that are beneficial for our survival. In addition, we also have some negative feelings that are associated when we feel threatened or we feel less than safe. All mammals have these basic kind of instincts and the wiring in our brain necessary to create these environments that support this desire to feel well. And so viewed through this lens all of the time, like all day long, we are kind of self-medicating. I'm using the word in air quotes here. We're obviously not self-medicating with medicine, but we're self-soothing. We're choosing behaviors that are likely to drive good brain chemistry and make us feel happy and healthy and secure. These chemicals aren't supposed to be on like all of the time, but we're wired to remember the behaviors that drive those chemicals. And so we'll do them again and again and again. If there's a positive survival value to that behavior, our brains want to know that. They want to be programmed to do that again. And obviously, if there's negative survival value, we want to avoid those behaviors. So there's been a lot of different hypotheses over the centuries about what motivates human behavior. One of the most recent kind of concepts that has been really driving Western medicine for the last 50, 60, 70 years has been this concept called the monoamine hypothesis. It was driven out of an attempt to understand depression. So it wasn't really driven out of a model of health. It was a model of illness and how to manage illness. And that may set us up for some of the problems inherent in this model. So I'm no medical historian. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of how this hypothesis was developed. I'm going to give you a very oversimplified version of it. But suffice it to say that as researchers tried to understand the chemistry that's going on in our brain, they understood these key signaling molecules called neurotransmitters or neurohormones. And as they started trying to elucidate each one of these, they wanted to understand what role that chemical played. And so when they understood that there was a neurotransmitter called serotonin, that when it was low in the cerebrospinal fluid, it tended to be related to depression. One thing led to another, and this theory came about saying that depression is a state of low serotonin. Therefore, if we can change and modulate or increase this serotonin, we will have solved the issue of depression. Of course, this idea seemed to make a lot of sense, and the pharmaceutical companies quickly began trying to create medications or drugs that would influence serotonin levels. And over the years, they've tried many different medications or kind of mechanisms of how to adjust this, but they all kind of are working on that same idea, that same basic concept of not enough. Okay, there's not enough of this serotonin. That's the problem. And I'm going to kind of explain a little bit more about that in just a second. Unfortunately, this model, or this way of thinking, this hypothesis has lots of blind spots and weaknesses. And although it may have explained some portion of the problem, it didn't explain the entire picture. And although some people saw the faults early on and understood that it wasn't a complete picture, it was such an appealing idea. This idea that there was one chemical, and if we manipulated that one chemical, we could solve this problem. It has really become the dominant model for years and years, decades. Now we have much more understanding, of course, of the complexity of what's happening inside of the brain, and these limitations of this monoamine hypothesis are being much more widely discussed. So before I get into much more of that, let's back up and let's understand how nerves communicate so you can see the role of these chemical signals, okay? Hopefully you've all seen some sort of artist rendition of a nerve cell at some point. If you haven't, maybe jump on and quick Google search, what does a nerve look like? And you can see, but I'm going to kind of walk you through this and try to paint the picture. The main part of the cell is called the cell body, and that's where the cell nucleus is. Shooting off of the cell body, kind of like little trees with branches, are little extensions called dendrites. And there's lots of potential ways for things to connect to those dendrites. There's also one much bigger extension, kind of long reaching arm called the axon. And that axon is what is kind of migrating, moving around, trying to connect with other neurons, and it connects with their dendrite. Okay, so you've kind of got this ability for the neurons to make connections with hundreds of other neurons, thousands of other neurons. I mentioned in the last episode, we have 100 billion neurons making thousands of connections each. There's trillions of connections in our brain. So at the end of the axon, at the end of that kind of little arm, there's a bulb and a little outpouching. And inside of that bulb are little packets, little chemical packets called vesicles. And inside those vesicles are the neurotransmitters. Okay, so there's the basic anatomy. When a nerve is trying to communicate, it will send an electrical signal along that nerve from the cell body down the axon. And when it gets to the end, it triggers the release of this neurotransmitter into a little space called a synapse. And that space is between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of another neuron. It's where they're going to kind of do a handshake. But instead of it being an electrical handshake, they're going to communicate via chemistry. And this is where these neurotransmitters come into play. The stimulus of the electrical current opens the vesicle and the neurotransmitter spills out into that little space. Now, on the other side, the receiving neuron has catcher's mitts, okay? We call them receptors, and they're specific receptors for specific chemicals. And when the right chemical docks on that receptor, if we get enough of that receptor firing, then that message goes on through and it goes back to electrical conduction. So it's kind of this chemical and electrical communication pathway. But it all hinges on the chemistry of these neurotransmitters in that synapse. So remember and think about that. This is going to play into the way kind of our current drug approaches are trying to solve the problem of neurological issues. Okay, so with that basic understanding, let's go a bit deeper. And now let's expose a couple of the problems with this dominant way of thinking. The first problem with this model is really that it's just far too simple. It's true that these brains work with simple chemical messengers, but there are so many more chemical issues going on than just one neurotransmitter. As I've already mentioned, there are lots of chemicals interacting with each other in the brain. Trying to manipulate one chemical without affecting all the other chemicals is just lack of sophistication in our understanding of how the brain works. It doesn't work that way. Over the past couple episodes, I've shared a little bit more of a complete model that integrates additional things like inflammatory cytokines, activated immune cells, toxins from our gut, blood sugar and insulin issues, as well as stress hormones and nutrient deficiencies. So all of those are chemicals, right? And all of those chemicals are at play in the way these neurotransmitters work. This underscores another weakness. Even if we understand that there's an imbalance or a low level of a neurotransmitter, without knowing what caused it, we're not going to be able to solve the problem. We have to know what's kind of at the root of this. A low neurotransmitter level may be caused by a deficiency in vitamin or mineral that's serving as an enzyme along a pathway to make the right neurotransmitter. It may be a deficiency in the protein amino acid building blocks that the body needs to build these neurotransmitters. It could be a totally different mechanism due to trauma. It could be a gut issue that's driving inflammation in the gut that's now creating neuroinflammation, or there could be heavy metal toxins or some other thing, right? You get the picture. The current mode of treatment is simply trying to force a temporary state where there's more neurotransmitters available in the synapse. It will work sometimes in the short term, but here's another major problem. When these chemicals are secreted into the synapse, they're supposed to dock and then release and be taken back up into the bulb. If the neurotransmitter stays in the synapse for a longer period of time, which is what these drugs attempt to do, it exposes those neurotransmitters to more enzymes that degrade. So let's say we already had a deficiency. That's the concept. We have not enough of these neurotransmitters in the first place. And now our mode of treating is to put those depleted reserves in more jeopardy. They're going to be out there in a space where the enzymes can degrade them even more. And so one of the challenges that happens is we go from a deficient state to a far greater relative deficient state over time. This may be one of the reasons why so many people get an initial benefit from this approach, but over time their doses need to increase or they need to add different medications and create cocktails, okay? Because we're not really addressing the deficiency in the first place or the mechanisms that are driving the deficiency. Okay, so don't get me wrong, this idea makes sense that we're tempted to believe in the simplicity of just pushing one button and solving the problem. It's straightforward. And I certainly don't fault anybody for going down that road because that's all that's been explained to most people. Most doctors, they think this is the best model out there. And although we wish it were that true, it's not. So there are enough people who get some benefit from these medications that this model has survived for 70 years. And it also often helps people go from like 10 out of 10 crisis problems down to, a 6 out of 10. So there's certainly improvement and they feel like, gosh, I'm never going to stop this because I don't want to go back to 10 out of 10. Okay. But unfortunately, there are millions of other people who are dealing with serious side effects from these medications and they're not satisfied with being at a 6 out of 10. It's not. So hopefully we're going to all live through the changing of these models. The functional mental health model is becoming more and more popular as more and more research proves how effective it is and more useful treatment models emerge. We don't have all of the answers yet, but it's an exciting, exciting area for continued research and new treatment approaches that are going to be much more holistic that address these root issues. So one other problem with this current hypothesis, we have to understand that these chemicals in our brains were designed to be released in small amounts, in specific circumstances and with specific reasons. They're designed to motivate and reward specific behaviors. It's not that our brain cells need to be just bathed in these chemicals all of the time. We have reserves of these neurotransmitters. So they're supposed to be tied somehow to positive behavior. And there's a purpose for their orchestrated release, okay? There's an idea right now floating around that we're supposed to feel great all of the time. I think it's because we all live in relative ease. We don't have as many overt stressors and things threatening our survival. And so our little brains are constantly looking for anything that disrupts our, feeling of awesomeness in our brain. So it's probably not a realistic expectation to assume that we're going to feel great all of the time. There's a tendency now for us to potentially over-pathologize things that are just normal human experiences. It often leads us to maybe over-treat minor things with drugs when they could be solved in many other ways. But then conversely, we might undertreat or mistreat the real serious issues because we're only looking at one little mechanism. All right, there's one other little idea I want you to chew on before we're done today. We know that without these neurotransmitters, we don't function well, we don't feel well, we don't live a full life. But the question is, are these chemicals the cause of how we feel, or are they the result of how we feel? could we shape our thoughts and our actions purposefully such that we can create the context where we make more of the chemicals we want? Now, obviously, that's true on a subconscious level. That's what all mammals and animals are doing. But as humans, we've got a lot more big, fluffy thinking parts of our brain. And so we can consciously and purposefully create meaning frames and ideas that allow us to get out ahead of our chemistry. In other words, if we don't feel well, we can act and we can do things that we know will create good feelings. We can kind of coach our own self into feeling better. We can get out ahead and not wait for our brain to tell us what to do, our more primitive brain, but our higher executive function part brain can reflect back and tell us to do things that we might not have felt like doing. Does that make sense? Here is where I think all this comes together. It's really a two-pronged approach. Functional physiology, functional mental health doctor, their job, my job, is to make sure that the body can create the right chemistry at the right time. That all of the factors that may be contributing to dysfunction at the physical level or the chemical level, that we've addressed those. But now the role of the mental health professional can help reframe experiences that we may have had and give us a new way to think about them so that we don't just go back into our fight or flight responses every time we're confronted with something that is stressful. And there's really a third piece of this puzzle, which is the role potentially of a health coach who can bridge and help somebody make positive changes that will support the physiology and the psychology. This is really the emerging model, and I love being right at the forefront and the cutting edge of this. So many people are looking for a new option. Talking about their problems doesn't usually solve problems. So sitting in a therapist's office rehashing all of the things that happened that week, that's not always the most efficient. Taking one drug to try to force the brain to manipulate one chemical doesn't address the root of the issues. So we need to create a new model that's inclusive of all of these aspects that really helps to drive the right chemistry at the right time for the right purpose. So I hope this episode has kind of got you thinking a little bit differently. If you or a loved one is struggling with any mental or physical health issue, please reach out and get help. Getting to the root of these issues is really the most rewarding part of the work that I do. So that's it for today. Share this episode with your family and friends. Remember to like and subscribe and click the little bell if you're watching this on YouTube. I appreciate your help in reaching more people with this important information. So until next time, let's go out and do good in the world.